This is the Registered Behavior Technician course presented by Shaza Attar. The course content was created by Shaza Attar and is the property of Autism Therapy and Training, Inc. All rights are reserved. This training program is based on the Behavior Analyst Certification Board 2018 RBT Task List 2nd edition and is designed to meet the 40-hour training requirement for the RBT credential. The program is offered independent of the BACB. Remember, in each class, we will have our active listening, a quiz, and a competency assessment.
Hello everyone and welcome back. Today is an important topic, one that we cannot and should not ever skip over when talking and learning about ABA. That is describing behavior and environment in observable and measurable terms. When talking about behavior and environment, we need to talk about it in a way that others could identify what we described if they saw it. Imagine you saw a car accident and you had to describe what happened to the police officer. If I said the cars smashed into each other, you might envision something like this. But if I said that the cars bumped into each other, you might envision this. Big difference, right? So the way that we talk about what we see is really important. The more details, the better. And using the right way to describe these events is crucial as well. So let's dive into this class and go right into it. So what is behavior? Think back to when we talked about measuring behaviors. If I tell you that the child had a tantrum and I wanted you to track it, you might say, easy enough. But how would you know what a tantrum was, since it could be so different depending on the child? So what is a tantrum? This is where an operational definition of behavior is important. We all know what a tantrum could look like, but a tantrum can differ from child to child. Some may flop to the floor and roll around, some may kick and scream, and some may punch the wall and kick it. What about aggression? What does that look like? Or self-injurious behavior. What does that look like? Behaviors need to be defined in a way that someone else observing the learner could identify that it is occurring. Behavior is everything and anything we do or say. A behavior can be a scream, hit, kick, or slamming of the door, picking up a pencil, closing our eyes, talking, smoking, eating. A person can observe a behavior occurring, describe what it looks like, and collect data on that behavior. Since a behavior is an action and uses the space around us, it can impact the environment. For example, opening a door, locking a door, or turning on the TV. Sometimes the impact of behavior on the environment is not obvious. Sometimes it only impacts or may only impact others. When we observe behavior, it is important to write down what was seen and not what we think or assume happened. Write down something like 3 hits to the head or bang head against hard surface. Often when people speak of behavior, they may say something like, I think he wanted the book, or he's not happy probably because he's tired. Rather than saying what you think or why you assume it's happening, state clearly what the behavior looks like. Wanting the book may be that the child was reaching or pointing to the book. Reaching and pointing would indicate a behavior was taking place. Avoid saying things like the child is angry or frustrated, but rather using describing words. For instance, tantrum is a broad label for behavior. It can be broken down into more descriptive parts such as crying, flopping to the floor, kicking, and so on. For another child, it could look like stomping feet on the floor and rolling around. Response is a single instance of a behavior, such as one self-hit. Behaviors can have a verbal or nonverbal response, overt responses, and covert responses. Overt responses are observable and measurable behaviors. We can see and hear these behaviors such as scream, hit, pulling hair, opening a window. There are also overt nonverbal behaviors such as a smile or shrugging shoulders. In practice, we are often watching overt behaviors. Covert behaviors are internal. what we call private events. They're measurable, but not observable. These are things like thoughts, perceptions, beliefs, and emotions. These are behaviors that are said to oneself, such as self-talk or negative statements, such as, "No one loves me." Covert behaviors can be accessed by practitioners when they ask their clients about their feelings or thoughts. One can measure these behaviors by heart rate, blood pressure, and brain waves. Describing what the behavior looks like is the topography. The topography is defined by the form of the behavior. For example, the hit, kick, or pulled hair. While function is defining the underlying cause. You will often hear your supervisor or other practitioners in the field talk about functions of behavior. Functions of behavior answer the why a behavior is occurring. For example, after conducting a functional assessment, we may say that a behavior is maintained by attention. We'll discuss this further at a later time. I want us to focus right now on the behaviors and topography. Behavior should be described clearly, without being ambiguous. We want to use observable terms so that we can remove confusion. If I said, "Teresa is acting up in class," that wouldn't help you when you go to measure that behavior because you wouldn't know what acting up was. Was she hitting others, screaming, taking toys away from her peers, clearing the table, and so on? An operational definition is when a behavior is described by its form and function. It's important for writing program goals and behavior intervention plans. A good definition allows two different observers to identify the same behavior. The definition should be objective, which refers to observable characteristics of the behavior. The definition should be clear that another could measure it. Complete, that it has boundaries of when it occurs and measuring time frame. For example, we may say that you can count a new episode of crying when there has been at least 1 minute of quiet. So those are the boundaries. The target behavior is the behavior that will be observed and measured. It is the one that the practitioner is interested in changing to help the client. Here's a story. When we're doing home-based therapy, we would often have team meetings with the psychologists, therapists, and parents. And one day the therapist said, "Diego is very anxious." And I think my jaw dropped. And I looked over at the psychologist who always told us not to use terms such as anxious. I think I got a little anxious myself, a little sweaty, heart racing, and clenching my teeth, thinking, uh-oh, I didn't do a good job training this therapist. Of course, it was a great opportunity to discuss this in front of the parents and everybody else. It was a great learning opportunity. So using a term like anxious would not be a behavioral term. We would need to define it in observable terms so that you could pinpoint what anxious looked like for that person. Some examples of observable terms are Johnny hit the teacher, Lily sat on the chair, Sam completed 4 worksheets. So going back to Diego, what did his anxious behavior look like? Was he sweating? Was he pacing? Was he sitting or standing still? Did he tense up? Did he grind his teeth? So let's do a comparison. I can describe anxious as the person had sweaty palms, not reliable, could be described as arriving late. He's cold, not brr cold, but cold as in he looks away when I'm talking to him, and so on. I've given some more examples because these are examples that we hear quite a bit in practice. And we want to ensure that when you discuss behaviors, you don't use the following labels such as angry, sad, hyper, tantrum. Replace these words with descriptive words, verbs such as screaming, crying, jumping, and so on. Avoid things like frustrated, wanted, thinking, ways of talking about behaviors that you can't really know. How do you know he wants something? How do you know he's frustrated? We cannot get into people's inner thoughts and feelings, but we can talk about what we see and the interaction between the behavior and environment. And please, please, please avoid saying things like, he had a meltdown. One, I don't think it's a professional way to speak of someone's behaviors. I personally don't like saying that about clients because parents may get hurt by this. Using these kinds of words and that kind of language may really hurt parents. And many parents do say things about their children that they had a meltdown, but what a parent says and a professional, what they say, is two different things. Or saying something like, oh, he went all crazy on me. You're probably wondering why I'm even saying this, and it's because therapists have said it before. And I caution you because being new into the field or as an RBT, you want to have a higher standard and a more professional way of speaking and interacting with your clients. I'll never forget this one conversation I had with a mom. A little off topic, but I share these stories because they have impacted my training practices and what I tell people, since I don't want you to fall into these mistakes. It can affect your career and relationship with your team. I had a therapist that once said to a family, "Do you think your son will ever get a job?" Firstly, her son was about 4 or 5. He was verbal and he did well in his programs. His mom called me upset, saying, "Why would the therapist or the person who is teaching my child question his future? She should be the one who is encouraging me and helping me." I felt terrible for the family. It was unfortunate. The therapist was fired and we moved on. Today, this little guy is now in high school, doing quite well. So be careful what you say to parents and families. Be mindful of the words you use and how you describe their child. Now that we've talked about behaviors and we've defined them in observable terms, we can now measure it. Your supervisor will be responsible for defining the behavior for you. You want to ensure that you can count it or measure the length of that behavior, that you can identify it when it occurs based on the definition. If you can't, then this needs to be brought up to your supervisor. Operationally defining a behavior allows all team members to know what to look for. It helps improve consistency, which will in turn benefit the client. So we're about to get into the quiz now, but before we do, let's do, of course, a Scrabble word. Today's word is zeal, which is spelled Z-E-A-L. This means great energy in pursuit of a cause. Which ones are behaviors described in observable and measurable terms? A. Crying. B. Frustrated. C. Kicking. D. Pushing. Or E. Upset. And the correct response is A. Crying. C. Kicking. B. Pushing. Well done. The RBT described the child's behavior by saying this: he had a tantrum that lasted 20 minutes. Is this a good description of the behavior? A, yes, or B, no. And the correct response is no. Thinking. Is this a covert or overt behavior? A, covert, or B, overt. And the correct response is A, covert. Dancing. Is this a covert or overt behavior? A, covert, or B, overt. And the correct response is B, overt. Well done. I'm not going to pass, Jenny said to herself. Is this a covert or overt behavior? A, covert, or B, overt. And the correct response is A, covert. Closing the door. Is this a covert or overt behavior? A, covert. B, overt. And the correct response is B, overt. Way to go. The teacher described Billy as inattentive. What is a better way to describe his behavior? A, not listening. B, looking out the window. Or C, poor listening. And the correct response is B, looking out the window. The teacher described Billy as not motivated. What is a better way to describe his behavior? A, walking around the classroom. B, not wanting to play with toys. Or C, poor listening. And the correct response is A, walking around the classroom. The environment is an event that can occur before or after a behavior. These environmental events can impact the occurrence of behavior. There are 3 parts we will look at which are essential when documenting a behavior. This is known as the 3-term contingency. The antecedent is environmental conditions that occur before the behavior. The behavior is what the client says or does. And finally, the consequence is the environmental condition that occurs after the behavior. Let's look at this in a visual way to help you understand the ABCs of behavior analysis. Imagine a cookie jar on the counter. The 3-year-old walks over, spots the cookie jar, and begins crying and reaching for it. Her mom hears the crying, sees her reaching, and gives her a cookie. The antecedent is the cookie jar on the counter. The behavior is crying and reaching, and the consequence is her mom giving her a cookie. Environmental events need to be described in observable and measurable terms. Clearly describing what happened, who was there, what was said or done, the time of day, location. All of this can help determine possible connections between the environment and behavior. As an RBT, you'll be required to document ABCs during functional assessments. Gathering information can help practitioners identify some variables in the environment that could be triggering behaviors. Writing clear and specific ABCs will be a very important part of your practice. Suppose a therapist says, Tommy had a behavior. He was crying and screaming. It happened at the lunch table. The information provided does not give us any specific details about what occurred before and after the behavior. Who was at the lunch table? Who was he sitting beside? Was something given or taken away from him? How did the therapist react when the behavior occurred? These are important pieces of information that can help us understand the environmental conditions when that behavior occurred. Antecedent events occur before the behavior. For example, the window is open and a cool breeze blows into your room. You get up and you close the window. Or maybe you start coughing and a stranger gives you a Halls. This actually happened to me. My family wanted to go out for dinner. It was summer and I had a horrible cold of some sort. I had laryngitis, bronchitis, you name it. I lost my voice and for a month I was coughing severely, that I actually fractured a rib. And here I am coughing away and a stranger comes up to me and hands me a pack of Halls. He probably wouldn't have given me that pack of Halls had I not been coughing that badly. So I think I annoyed him quite a bit. And so there's your ABCs. When we look at behaviors and why people do what they do, we're interested in the before and after of that behavior. In practice, it is interesting to see what triggers a child's behavior. For example, you may put a book on the table and the child says book, or maybe you say it's washroom time and the child screams. When we talk about antecedent manipulation strategies, you will see how identifying antecedents that impact a behavior will be important in treatment planning. But antecedents are not the only environmental events that could affect the behavior. Consequences, which follows the behavior, can greatly influence behavior as well. Remember back to our topic on reinforcement and punishment. A behavior can increase or decrease depending on whether it has been reinforced or punished. Going back to our example of closing the window, the consequence of closing the window stops the cold air from coming into your room, which keeps you from getting cold. When your client engages in a behavior, the consequence of you saying, "good job," following through with the skill, will impact whether that behavior increases or decreases over time. This is so crucial in your practice. When you can identify the consequences that you have been using contingent on your learner's behavior, it'll shine some light as to why these behaviors continue to exist. For example, a therapist was working with a learner and she notified the team that he kept clapping to get his reinforcer. So let me paint this picture for you a little clearer. Imagine you're sitting across the table from your learner. The cookie is on the table close to you. You're teaching. You're teaching the child to, let's say, imitate clapping, tapping the table, and so on. The child has learned to clap his hands, and then he would get the reinforcer, and this was, let's say, in the past when he was clapping his hands. So that's been reinforced. However, the therapist is now no longer working on clapping, but he continues to clap. So I observed this behavior, and I saw that the therapist teaching the child to tap the table now, but was delivering the cookie when he began clapping. She would pick up the cookie and put it in front of her. Reacting to the clapping was still reinforcing his clapping behavior. So in a sense, it was almost prompting her to pick up the cookie every time that she saw him clapping. Another example that I've seen in practice is the child is working at the table and begins to drift away and look at the wall. The therapist immediately pulls out a new reinforcer, and the child is attending again. When we react to behaviors in this way, we're inadvertently reinforcing the problem behavior. These are accidental, but it's important to watch your own behavior and how you're reacting to the behaviors around you. That's why I caution therapists not to flash the reinforcer or to remind the child of the reinforcer during teaching, especially when they're off task. We'll talk about this more when we discuss teaching practices. Okay, so it's quiz time, but once again, let's get another Scrabble word in there, and this word is Joe, spelled J-O. This means a sweetheart. I use this one all the time, especially at the end when you're stuck with that J and you don't know what else to put. So there you go. There's your two-letter J word. So enjoy. We'll see you at the quiz. Which ones are consequences? A. Billy was crying. His mom said, "Stop crying." B. Tommy was running. He tripped and fell and started crying. C. Frank was yelling in class. His teacher removed him from the classroom. Or D. Tracy began screaming. Her teacher walked over and asked her what was wrong. And the correct response is A, C, and D. Way to go. Which one defines a consequence? A, before the behavior, B, the behavior, or C, after the behavior? And the correct response is C, after the behavior. Which one defines an antecedent? A, before the behavior, B, the behavior, or C, after the behavior? And the correct response is A, before the behavior. All right, let's review quickly. The three-term contingency, the ABCs, that you will begin using in practice will help you identify interactions between the behavior and environment. This does not mean that we have a function or a reason why the behavior is occurring, but we have an understanding of situations, people, items, and tasks that could have influenced that behavior. We need to further investigate and conduct assessments to understand why. It's important to remember that form and function are essential when looking at behavior. But form alone does not tell us why a behavior is happening. The form of the behavior, whether it's a kick, hit, or scream, could all have the same function. We'll get into this in more depth when we talk about functional assessments. This will help you understand why a learner engages in some behaviors during teaching when you use reinforcers. You may think that you have identified a child's reinforcers, delivered them during teaching, but you're still not having success. Your child is still not learning or is engaging in problem behaviors. When we get into our next class about preference assessments, I hope that this will clarify these possible problems during teaching and give you some solutions to improve your quality of therapy. Remember, behaviors and environment need to be described in observable and measurable terms. If you can see it, then you can measure it. Use verbs to describe what the behavior or situation looked like. Avoid general non-descriptive terms such as frustrated, anxious, or sad, but use words to describe what it looked like for that specific person. I want to thank you for joining me today, and we'll see you at our next class. All right, so welcome to the competency assessment component. You'll be watching a variety of videos. The goal here is for you to write down what you observe in observable and measurable terms. So pay attention to the behaviors that you see and write down in the most amount of detail that you possibly can. Good luck. Now this was a tricky one, and you can see when we're dealing with problem behaviors, a lot of things happen, and to write down as much detail can be quite challenging. But you could see here that the individual was unbuttoning and tugging on his jacket. He was yelling and pointing. He was waving his arms around. Now, of course, you can go into more depth as to where his arms were. So maybe they were above his shoulder level. Maybe he was yelling in a very high pitch, or maybe he was, very just kind of mumbling. These are things that you can write down, and the more detail that you have, the better it is. All right, let's go on to the next one. So let's unpack this one. Now you might have found this to be easier, but maybe not. Here you see in the video she was shaking her closed palms. She was swaying back and forth a little bit. You know, when someone's excited, sometimes they have that little bit of swaying. She was clapping and holding her hands together. And of course she was doing that little quick shake. Again, you know, you could be more descriptive in where her hands were. You could talk about where she was sitting. So she was sitting on a chair in front of her computer. She's looking at her computer screen. Again, you don't want to use words like excited or happy, but you want to describe that, you know, she was smiling, and you know, and those would describe what her happiness and excitement looked like. So if somebody was not in the room, could they understand what excitement looked like? All right, let's try the next one.
Can you talk about
So here you see, again, we're looking at the woman's behavior. You know, she's going right up to the dog, you know, nose to nose with the dog. She's rubbing the dog. She's talking to the dog, and she's holding the dog's paws and, you know, his head and neck. And so these are, again, descriptions, and again, you can even be as descriptive as saying how gentle or rough she was with the dog. So, you know, she appeared to be very gentle with the dog. And when you're thinking of your clients and you're talking about, you know, how they touched maybe another peer or, you know, another individual, were they rough, were they gentle? That is very helpful when you're writing ABCs, or when you're talking to your supervisor about what the behavior looked like.
So here was an individual who, had this very monotone facial expression as he was working in front of his computer. You notice that he's rubbing his hands over his face a lot. He seems to be sighing. He's making a phone call. He directs his open palms towards the computer, and he's almost like jabbing, doing this jabbing motion while he's yelling. So again, some behaviors you'll notice are very easy to describe, such as, if the person is smiling or frowning, versus, some motions with hands or bodies that you might find are a little bit harder to describe. So I really do encourage you to work with your supervisor or, your coworkers at practicing these, so that when you do write your ABCs and, when it comes to an assessment time, or your supervisor is looking at your ABCs or how you've described a behavior, to be sure that you've written it in observable and measurable terms. So if you didn't write these in observable, measurable terms, if you wrote something like he looked angry, or he looked excited, or he looked anxious, make sure you break those words down into verbs so that we really know what's going on. Now, you'll notice one thing in the first video, we had the behavior going over and over, and that was just to help you guys out. But you notice all the other videos after that, that the image was still. Most often when a behavior occurs, it's not occurring and you're writing down your ABCs, unless you're doing some kind of a functional behavior assessment. Most often, the behavior occurs and then you have to write it down based on your memory. So you do have to pay attention to what is going on, and you do have to recall what has happened so that you can write it in as much detail as you possibly can. Okay, let's go to the next one. Cute little baby. All right, so let's unpack this one. So what did you see? Well, we saw the little baby tugging at its ears. They were taking bites of their food. The baby was smiling and giggling. So again, this one might have been a little easier. The behaviors were really clear. You could describe this probably with a lot more ease than some of the other ones. All right, let's continue.
All right, so if we were to, use our general kind of terms, we might say this individual looks bored. Now, bored looks different for many different people. So what did bored look like for her? Well, she's resting her face on her palm. She seems to be sighing. She's looking downwards. So these are some of the behaviors that we notice that could identify boredom for this individual. All right, so let's do one more, and then we're going to give you guys a little treat at the end of it. Okay, so here you see the little girl, she's rubbing her eyes, she seems to be talking, she's pouting, and she's rubbing her nose. So again, these behaviors are a little easier to jot down and to identify. Now the last video that we're going to show you is one where I want you guys to write down the ABCs of the entire situation. So you're going to be looking at the environment, you're going to be looking at the behavior, and you're going to write all of those down in observable, measurable terms. So I'm not going to give you the answers for this one. I want you to really think about this, and from everything that we've talked about and we've learned, I want you to work on this on your own, and then make sure that you're using this in practice and prepare for your competency assessment that the BCBA will do just before you get the credential. Good luck.